I've been thinking about resentment lately and how subtle it is. You rarely hear it discussed as something deeply damaging, yet if you look closely, resentment resembles a slow-growing emotional cancer. It doesn't usually appear high on the list of spiritual obstacles, but perhaps it should. Resentment works quietly with everyday frictions and slights, gathering them, concentrating them, and incubating them until they alter the heart. How should we understand resentment, recognize it, and allow it to dissolve, in a way consistent with original Christianity?
Resentment is spiritually dangerous precisely because it disguises itself as reasonableness. Unlike anger, which is loud and visible, resentment is quiet and chronic. It presents itself as realism, caution, or earned wisdom, rather than as something needing healing. It certainly does function like a slow-growing cancer in the soul. Small injuries are stored rather than exposed. They are rehearsed privately and gradually reshape perception. Memory is curated as grievance rather than received as truth. Over time, resentment narrows the heart's capacity to love without ever announcing itself as hatred. Because it does not appear scandalous, resentment rarely appears on the list of confessed faults. People confess anger or pride, but seldom confess keeping score or quietly rewriting others as irredeemable. Yet what corrodes love quietly can be more destructive than what attacks it openly. Resentment forms through ordinary, unresolved friction. Hurt is stored, narratives are built around it, and those narratives harden into identity. This feels protective rather than sinful. Resentment promises safety from further injury, but the cost is the loss of freedom to love. Original Christianity does not deny injustice, but it recognizes that healing cannot occur by collecting unpaid moral debts. Letting go of resentment does not mean pretending the injury was insignificant. It means refusing to let injury become identity. Healing involves exposing resentment honestly before God, recognizing it within oneself rather than defining another by it, and allowing the fear beneath it to be healed. Resentment survives through secrecy and justification. Once clearly seen and named, its power weakens. Letting go doesn't require excusing harm or abandoning boundaries. It requires releasing the hardened structure that formed around the wound so that love can flow freely again. Resentment is pain that has decided to remain because it believes leaving would be unsafe. Original Christianity does not shame that fear, it heals it.
Is it accurate to regard resentment as long-term storage and cataloging of unforgiveness?
Yes, that is an accurate description, provided unforgiveness is understood in a therapeutic and spiritual sense, rather than a purely legal one. Resentment can be described as unforgiveness that has gone underground. It's not active hostility, but stored, unprocessed injury that has been preserved rather than healed. It is pain that has been archived instead of transformed. Resentment stores past wrongs intact, preserves their emotional charge, and keeps them ready for reference. It's not forgetting, but curation. This is why resentment often feels reasonable and even wise. It's organised pain. Many believe they have forgiven because they made a decision to do so, yet resentment persists because forgiveness defined as a declaration can occur without healing. In the deeper Christian sense, forgiveness isn't merely a decision, but a process of digestion. Resentment arises when the mind declares forgiveness, while the heart keeps the wound undigested. Resentment feels safer than forgiveness, because it promises protection through memory and vigilance. Forgiveness that heals requires exposure and relinquishing control. Resentment survives when injury remains hidden and justified. Original Christianity addresses resentment not by command, but by illumination. When the wound is brought honestly before God, resentment loses the secrecy it requires to survive. Thus, resentment may indeed be understood as long-term storage of unforgiveness, not as moral defiance, but as unhealed pain preserved for self-protection.
When you say that resentment loses the secrecy it needs to survive, it almost sounds as though resentment has a mind of its own, aimed at self-preservation. Did the Church Fathers speak about it in that way?
The early Christian writers didn't describe resentment in modern psychological language, but they recognized that certain inner movements behave almost as though they were living forces seeking to sustain themselves. They called these movements the passions. Writers such as Evagrius Ponticus, John Cassian, and Maximus the Confessor describe the passions as disordered movements of the soul that attach themselves to injury or desire, repeat inner narratives, seek justification, and resist exposure. They sometimes spoke of them as if they possessed strategy, not because emotions were literally conscious, but because once rooted, these patterns became predictable and self-protective. Resentment corresponds closely to what they called remembrance of wrongs. A wound occurs, the memory remains, then something begins to curate that memory. The grievance is rehearsed, defended, and justified. It resurfaces when challenged and resists contradiction. In this way, it behaves like a structure that seeks to continue existing. The desert tradition emphasized confession not only of actions, but of thoughts. Hidden narratives gain strength in isolation. John Cassian observed that certain thoughts lose much of their power when spoken honestly to a spiritual elder. What is hidden feels objective. What is exposed reveals itself as interpretation. Resentment thrives in private rehearsal. When brought into the light before God or another person, its inevitability often weakens. The Fathers didn't claim resentment had a literal mind, but they recognized that once a passion takes root, it shapes perception. It filters new events through stored grievance. It gathers confirming evidence. It can feel like realism because it quietly recruits proof to sustain itself. At its core, resentment persists because it promises safety. It tells the soul that letting go invites further harm. It builds a protective narrative that resists exposure because exposure threatens its illusion of security. Illumination does not attack resentment, it reveals the fear beneath it. Once fear is revealed, healing can begin. In this sense, resentment behaves as though it wants to survive, yet it is not alive in itself. It's sustained by cooperation, by rehearsal, justification, secrecy, and identification. When that cooperation is withdrawn through honest naming and exposure, its structure weakens. The Father's insight can be summarized simply: remembrance of wrongs is not merely an emotion, but a harmful pattern that sustains itself. When exposed honestly before God, it loses the secrecy that keeps it alive.